have built our firm around one idea: to lead our clients from where they are to where they want to be. But the ability to deliver the leadership and service our clients deserve doesn't happen by chance. It's a product of who we are. We are engaged, diverse, and innovative thinkers who go above and beyond what is expected because we know our efforts will carry us to achievements others never thought possible. We are unafraid to take the necessary risks that lead to new successes. We embrace change because we know sound principles will guide us through new opportunities. We are committed to empowering our people, our clients, and our communities to become every part of what they aspire to be. We are persistent on our journey forward. It is our openness to collaboration, our desire to achieve better, our character, our vision, and most of all, our people that make us who we are. That's the HB difference. We are Husch Blackwell.
And good afternoon, everybody. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate those who put that together for us, and welcome. Our numbers suggested that we would have somewhere ranging into the 2,000 mark of those who are participating. I haven't updated my list right now, but welcome to all of you. We might have some of you where I should have said good morning in California or Colorado, but it's really great to have you with us. If you were on for a couple of minutes before noon, you saw a little bit of housekeeping, but let me add a couple of things. First, I'm Tom Godar, and I practice obviously in the area of employment and labor relations, and we have been following as a team, and I've been following the COVID developments for, seems like forever, doesn't it? 18, 20 months, and now we're looking at a vaccine mandate that came out, and it's exciting, an opportunity. Remember what happened when the feds came out with the PPP loans and the unanswered questions there? Well, we have a lot of that. But fortunately, we have some pretty good guesses, certainly some experience that might lead us to where we're going. But I'll be honest with you, we don't know precisely where that might be yet. I went to the Packer game last night with some friends, and it was a wonderful time. But somebody could have asked who's going to win. And having watched the Packers get eaten alive by New Orleans, I had no idea. So in the same way, we're looking at exactly where the CMS or OSHA might go with regulations based on the president's announcement a couple of weeks ago. We can't be absolutely sure. That's one thing I'll be honest with you right now. Before we begin, if you have questions, do please fill them in. I'm seeing that some questions are already popping up. What we'll try to do is have some time at the end to take some of those questions. We certainly won't be able to answer them all, but they'll give us a platform as we continue to provide opportunities to communicate with you in this way through webinars and otherwise. We also would suggest that you go to the resource folder that should be displayed on your machine. There you're going to see other resources that my colleagues and I have put together, like the Vaccine Policy Generator, which is really pretty terrific. We also provide legal overviews. I think we had one within 24 hours of the announcement on the 9th of September. And we just added more today that was more healthcare specific. So take a look at the resources that we have out there. There's also an icon that allows you to take a look at the PDF of our presentation. So feel free to take a look at those items as well as participate live. Let me tell you as well that as we go forward, I'm going to be joined by some very talented members of our team from around the country. Here in Wisconsin, where I practice, Tom O'Day will join us. He also practices out of Wisconsin, but many of us practice without really much regard to state lines. Tom will join us, as will Barbara Grandjean. Barb is practicing in our Colorado office in Denver. And like so many others, she's answering questions and giving counsel as well as preparing clients from around the country. And finally, we have a really great opportunity to interact with our colleague from Washington, D.C., Brian Hendricks. Brian Hendricks is an OSHA MSHA expert, and a lot of this might be driven by some of the ways in which we view OSHA. And so Brian's going to help us gain some insight there. So with that, let's take a look at what our agenda is going to follow up with today. We're going to try to take a look at what we do know and what we don't know about our vaccine mandate. We're going to take a look, and Brian will help us with this, on OSHA's current emergency temporary standard, ETS. You'll see that come up for healthcare. We think that will give us some clues, but honestly, we can't be sure. Tom and Barb, we're going to talk about what considerations employers might have for implementing mandatory vaccine policies now, or what might be, if you will, mandated or forced upon them. Do you want to take preparation steps? And that will be covered as well when we talk about what employers can do. So strap in, we're going to go for a ride right now, and we're going to try to do this in an hour. Holy cow. All of us have said it's impossible. I think we can do it. So what do we know so far? I hope you're taking this all in. You're gathering it together. Okay. Well, we do know a few things. We do know, for instance, that we have a lot of people on this webinar because we don't know what we don't know yet. We do know that there are about 70% of the adults in this country have been vaccinated. And we do know that of the 29%, at least according to a recent voter poll, of those who have not been vaccinated, 83% of them say they won't get vaccinated, even if it threatens their livelihood. I don't know if those are hard numbers when the question is called, when income is stopping or being threatened to stop, but that's one of the things we think we know. We think we know that there's a deal of support for President Biden's steps. I have seen polling that goes from 48% favorable to 60% favorable. But that means there's a lot of people who aren't thrilled with the vaccine mandate. We do know that OSHA and CMS are going to provide probably similar, but we don't know that they're going to be identical information about where we're going. And we know that the healthcare community has largely been supported. That's the institutional community, not necessarily all of the employees or players in it, has largely been favorably disposed towards the mandate. And we know that many have already initiated their own mandates. We know that other organizations and sectors of our economy are much less enthusiastic. Last I looked, the contractors and the employees in the trades were not very eager to become mandated to have a vaccine. And we know that when some of these mandates have come out, particularly in healthcare organizations, literally hundreds of employees from large organizations have stepped forward with requests for a religious exemption or accommodation. And Barbara and Tom will talk more about that. So we know that this is not going to go forward without resistance. So what do we not know yet? Lots. In healthcare, we know that CMS is going to look at healthcare providers as those who are certified to provide Medicare and Medicaid, those facilities. Does that include, for instance, my friends who are on in Wisconsin and around the country who care for the disabled and state pass-through programs with Medicaid dollars? My guess is yes, but we don't know that for sure. For federal contractors, is this only going to apply in the future because it's a contract, or will there be some way to incentivize or punish or otherwise create a look-back period? We don't know how to count 100 employees. I used to go 1, 2, 3. I taught my children, somebody taught me, but ain't that easy. Are we going to count by facility, as in the Warren Act, or using the FMLA type framework, the number of employees within a certain distance? Are all part-time employees going to be used? Is it going to be full-time equivalent employees? Are you going to divide the number of employees by a certain number of hours per year? Is it going to include new employees? Are you going to step into and out of the mandate? Is it going to be a snapshot in time like the EEO 100 report, or like some of the regulations are calling for now in terms of healthcare providers talking about where they're at on vaccines, even though it's not mandated, and that snapshot in time takes place. Unfortunately, we don't know. I think that it's likely, now my prognostication, I'm like a sports broadcaster or a weather forecaster, they can't hold me to any of this. It's likely to be more like the joint employer standard for the EEO 100 reports, which is going to be broad, because the broad mandate that the president talks about, I don't think is going to be parsed into the narrowest possible sections. So a control group test like you have for ADA or ERISA governed issues may well be the test. And so this will be a broad count. Only a year and a half ago, people were trying to be under 500 employees to get loans. And now we have people wanting to figure out how can they lay off employees now? Is there going to be a look back period? Is it going to be on September 9th? I'm going to tell you, for those near 100, it's going to be broad. And we can, I'll buy you a beer later if I'm wrong. So what else don't we know? Will there be required testing for those who get vaccinated for what employers, through guidance by EEOC or through OSHA or somebody, for medical or religious reasons? And will we then go and say, well, is that a reasonable accommodation, or is that just part of the mandate? Our guess is that it's not going to be a soft mandate. It's vaccinations or else. And then we get to the or else. And I think I'm going to leave Barbara and Tom to talk more about that. But it's likely, yes, that there's going to be required testing as potentially accommodation. And then who's going to pay for the tests? Who's going to pay for the administrative burden of the tests and keeping track of the tests? Who's going to get paid, if anybody, for the test taken? If you have to come into work with a degree, you don't have to pay for schooling. But if you're mandating the test, you have to pay, and maybe even overtime, for someone to spend an hour going to a testing facility, receiving the test. Are they going to ask for their mileage reimbursement? And can employers impose more strict accommodations? Can states continue to impose more strict accommodations? Or will this impose not only a floor, but a ceiling? And as I started to talk about, who keeps the testing status records? How are they going to be kept? Who's going to get them? When are they going to be sent out? So we know that there's going to be some real questions as to what that is going to be. And we're hoping, of course, that there's a certain simplicity to this. But I challenge you to think of all the record keeping you do for the federal government and which of those has achieved that simplicity. I'm a little bit concerned, honest to goodness, about how many of us are going to have all of the resources we need to add still more record-keeping requirements to our place. So those are some of the questions that we don't know. A couple of other things: potential for litigation. Well, I've heard it said 23, I've heard it written 24, I've seen it written 24 attorney generals have threatened litigation. We know that Governor Brnovich, I don't know if I pronounced that perfectly, from Arizona, who, by the way, is running for Senate, I believe, has brought the first challenge to the Biden COVID mandate, if you will. Arizona has brought that. New York, I think a lawsuit might have been started yesterday or today on a wrongful discharge for a hospital that imposed a vaccine mandate. In Texas, they said, nah, you're not going anywhere with that. So what are we learning from some of those challenges? We know that they'll come fast and furious, and frankly, I'm going to allow Brian Hendricks, who has our next part, to talk more about how that's been done in the context of OSHA regulations, because we do know, at least historically, what's taken place. And likewise, when we look at the new regulations, we already have some regulations coming about entities that take Medicare and Medicaid funding, and we're going to have the promise of those regulations coming out in October. We're told that CMS had a good bit of running ahead of OSHA on this, that OSHA wasn't prepared as CMS was. Yet we're going to see OSHA, I believe, likely come out relatively soon. So I don't think we're going to be waiting, folks, until December for regulations. I think we're going to see them in a matter of weeks. That's the promise. And even OSHA might be just a matter of a week, 2 weeks beyond that. So there's going to be a lot of pressure put on OSHA and the administration to make those somewhat more employer friendly. And we don't know precisely how that will come out. The new regulations will likely require written COVID-19 plans if we know anything about what has been done, employee screening, paid training for employees. Employers will have to pay, we think, for employees getting the vaccine and requiring testing, perhaps, on the testing. So the announcement, as I said, came out in mid-August for CMS. They have a head start. So we will probably have another webinar soon, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and we'll certainly continue to provide alerts to you as the world unfolds. So there's a bit we know, a good bit we don't know, and now we're going to get into some more information that may be useful even as we prepare to know more. Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit more about OSHA's role in this?
Sure, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. With regard to what we know is based in part on what OSHA has done previously. And by previously, I don't mean by several years ago, I mean by a few months ago. Very shortly after, or the day of the inauguration, President Biden issued an executive order directing OSHA and other agencies to evaluate the need for new regulations, emergency regulations, to address employees' exposure to COVID. OSHA had a deadline of March. It blew that deadline and went into May and eventually into June to say, yes, we are going to issue an emergency temporary standard. Now, emergency temporary standard is a standard that OSHA may issue without going through a long rulemaking process. It can do this if there, in OSHA's estimation, is a grave danger to employees that a rule is necessary to address. OSHA did that with regard to COVID, but it only applied the emergency temporary standard to certain healthcare workers. OSHA's position is that vaccinated or not, healthcare workers who come into contact with or are likely to come into contact with or treat COVID positive patients are at most risk. And therefore, it is going to apply, or it did apply, the emergency temporary standard to those individuals. Now, if you look at the rule, it exempts a whole host of people in the healthcare industry. For example, people who are working from home, but work in healthcare, so telehealth, or administrative folks who are able to work from home who aren't patient-facing. Those folks are exempt from the emergency temporary standard. Now, we know that originally the idea was OSHA was expected to issue a rule that would apply to all employers. That rule was changed with the advent largely of vaccination and the lull that we saw in infections this summer to only apply, or to be narrowed to healthcare. However, it's fairly safe to assume that OSHA would like to, if they're required to by the White House, and they've been directed to, they have a lot of support in their minds, at least, for a broader rule that looks currently like the healthcare rule. And so, as Tom explained, we would expect, if OSHA does issue an ETS requiring a vaccine, for it to include some other things. For example, the COVID-19 plan. Now, there are several states that have adopted an emergency temporary standard. They all require a COVID-19 plan. So the COVID-19 plan has a bunch of different elements. It's basically for employers who employ over 10 people. It has to be a written plan. A plan that says this is how we're going to deal with this particular hazard, the hazard of infection. You're supposed to conduct a workplace or a workplace-specific hazard assessment, provide training, adopt policies and procedures, implement it, provide for the safety coordinators to enforce or to review compliance with the policies and procedures that you adopt. So the basic thing that we expect, again, this is all supposition, is first the COVID plan. So you're going to need a written plan if you've got more than 10 employees. Health screening and medical management is another element of the healthcare emergency temporary standard that we would expect to see. And these are kind of the nuts and bolts, or the nitty-gritty of what you do for your employees to address this hazard. So you're going to screen them, screen employees for certain conditions that they would have, or that they're going to let you know that they have, whether they're feeling ill, that kind of thing. You're going to provide employer required testing at no cost. And we'll get into the testing issue in a bit. And you will hear us talk about a hard mandate or a soft mandate. The administration has suggested that it is encouraging OSHA or directing OSHA to adopt or require a soft mandate, meaning that you will have the opportunity as an employee either to get vaccinated, to be vaccinated, or to have a test on some regular frequency, regular cadence, once a week, once a shift. We're not sure. OSHA, frankly, probably isn't either. So that would be a soft. A hard mandate would be you are required to be vaccinated, or if you're not vaccinated, you're going to have to find other employment, assuming that there isn't an ADA required accommodation the employer is allowed to provide or required to provide you. These health screening and medical management issues also includes requirements for removing workers from the workplace. For example, when those individuals have been potentially exposed or when they're exhibiting signs of illness. And then, of course, return to work guidance. And they want that to be specific to the CDC's guidance on return to work. Training, we expect that OSHA will want you to train your employees and make sure that they understand. And this is OSHA's verbiage here. They want you to ensure that employees understand disease transmission, tasks, situations in the workplace that could result in infection, etc. And they want you to notify your employees of their rights under the OSHA Act for complaining about certain conditions in the workplace related to safety and health. So their whistleblower rights. Record keeping and reporting are also two elements that we would expect to see in any broad-based rule. And I know that there was a question, and we should have addressed it at the outset. The White House, in its directive to OSHA, said that we want this to apply to employers who have 100 or more employees. We do not know, and that's different from the healthcare ETS, OSHA's healthcare ETS. We don't know how they're going to count employees, as Tom pointed out. So small employers or smaller employers aren't likely, according to the White House at least, to be required to comply with the forthcoming ETS from OSHA. The problem with that, though, is that the more exempt, the larger the number of exempt employers and the larger the number of employees that the ETS fails to cover, the more difficult it is for OSHA to defend the rule under the OSHA. Again, if it's such a grave danger to all employees to work with others who are not vaccinated, how is it that if you're a small employee, that same danger isn't present? That's the problem. That's one of the questions they will have.
Brian,
and then finally,
Brian, sorry to interrupt. One thought on I saw a question about the screening and then the removal and then the potential to pay for the removal if an employee is removed from the workplace because of a COVID restriction. And under the healthcare emergency temporary standard, which currently applies to healthcare entities, there are requirements for the employer to remove employees if they become aware of certain fairly common sense exposures. There are requirements for the employee to inform the employer if the employee is exposed, confirmed COVID, or maybe confirmed COVID based on a observation from a medical professional. And there are, under the healthcare emergency standard, which may and perhaps even likely will be the foundation for the new rule, there are requirements that the employer either pay the employee for the time that they're removed from the workplace because of the exposure, or allow them to use their accrued paid time off, sick leave, vacation, some other bucket that you have specific to COVID. There are caps under this emergency temporary standard for healthcare, and that may be what the new rule applies to every workplace that has more than 100 employees across the country.
That's correct. I mean, we may see that. If we do see that, that's going to increase the cost of the rule substantially and increase the interest that employers will have in challenging this rule. It's also outside of OSHA's traditional area of expertise when it comes to assessing the costs of a rule. Pay is not generally something that OSHA deals with. And covering costs of those types of removals is not something that OSHA is all that comfortable dealing with. It will also, if they go that route, extend the amount of time it will take OSHA to issue a rule. So the emergency temporary standard for healthcare took OSHA somewhere between, 3 months and 6 months to promulgate. It's over 300 pages in length. This rule, I think, were caught fairly flat-footed by the White House. I don't think that they were notified well in advance of this desire to see a new emergency temporary standard. So the more complicated it is, the longer it will take for them to promulgate the rule. And I think that they're under pressure to get the rule out the door pretty quickly. So it could be that they go for a lean rule that doesn't require those elements and focuses almost entirely on vaccination. We just don't know. But your point is a good one. If those are all things that we see in the healthcare rule that apply to healthcare, and we may see them in the next iteration of the emergency temporary standard, the broader, it will be a decision that OSHA will have to make, and they'll have to weigh whether or not they want to go that route, against the likelihood that it will be challenged. And finally, about to your point about vaccination, the way that OSHA addressed vaccination in the healthcare emergency rule was they wanted employers, or they required employers to support vaccination. They did not require healthcare workers to be vaccinated or employers to require their employees to be vaccinated. So it doesn't require, the current ETS doesn't require healthcare employees or employers to require vaccination of their employees. What it does is provide reasonable time and paid leave for vaccinations. In the rule, OSHA said that was on average going to be about 3 days if there was an adverse reaction to a vaccination. That's the average, though. It said reasonable time. And so if there is a case to be made for longer and for pay to be provided for a longer period of time, if it's reasonable, OSHA may require employers to do that.
Brian, one thing that Tom Godar mentioned was the prospect for litigation even before or when the rule is announced. And what are your thoughts on that based on what you've seen with OSHA emergency temporary standards that have been used historically over the last couple decades?
The rule will be challenged if it requires, whether it be a hard or a soft mandate. If it's a soft or a hard mandate, it will be challenged. It'll be challenged by employers. It'll be challenged by trade associations, and certain states will challenge the rule. Based entirely on the track record that OSHA has issued 10 emergency temporary standards since about 1971. 6 of those have been challenged in court. OSHA lost 5. And those cases that OSHA lost, those were more traditional or more straightforward type of emergency temporary standards. I think that they will have a very difficult time supporting or defending a rule that requires vaccination, whether it be a hard or a soft mandate. So I will tell you that I'm virtually certain that it will be challenged, and their chance of success, OSHA's chance of success in defending the rule isn't great based on their track record alone, but also based on the arguments that I know that I would use if I were to challenge this rule on behalf of an employer or a trade association. They're going to have a tough time, and they know it, and they do not want to lose. So there's this push and pull between the White House and OSHA and the solicitor's office. They want to put out the best, most defensible rule. White House wants them to put out a rule pretty quickly. So they are, I'm sure, working very hard right now to come up with a rule that they can defend. It's going to give them the best chance of success in court.
And to that point as well, Brian, some of the questions here are asking about how much time will we have in order to implement whatever the rule requires? And if there's litigation, there is a potential that the rule is put on hold or it's enjoined. What would employers then have time to implement? Should we expect that the rule is going to be in effect immediately? Should we expect 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? What do you think based on what you've seen with prior rules?
So the emergency temporary standard for healthcare they had about 30 days to come into compliance. It was effective immediately, but OSHA said that they would not enforce it. I think it was for 30 days. I would fully expect that to be the case with this rule. The next emergency temporary standard, my guess is that they'll give us somewhere between 30 and 60 days to comply. I would guess 30 days will be the where they'll come down on it. They would like to say comply now, but they know that that's not going to be feasible. It won't be possible for employers to comply immediately. So you'll have some time. It's also the case that when the rule is challenged, rather, they will move to stay the enforcement of the effectiveness of the rule with the court, and that will occur in a matter of weeks. It'll be challenged in the Court of Appeals for a federal circuit. I don't know which one, probably several, and then they will choose. It'll be by lottery. And the last time in an OSHA rule that occurred, it ended up in the DC circuit, but it could happen elsewhere. But the court will move very quickly on that stay request within weeks. So hopefully our clients will know very shortly after the rule is issued whether the clock is ticking or not in terms of compliance. What I would say is I would start preparing to comply with a soft mandate at a minimum.
Right. And that's one of the nice things. For everyone on this call has been helping healthcare employers for the most part, but some non-healthcare industries that have decided to implement a soft mandate or a hard mandate. We've been helping them implement those over the last 60 days or so. And I would echo what Brian said. It's important to start the process, start thinking about some of the different things that are going to come into play if there's not a nationwide injunction, if you do have to comply with this OSHA standard. And that's where some of the experience that we have with healthcare is very beneficial. So what Brian talked about with the OSHA emergency temporary standard, again, we don't know for sure, but that may apply in the new rule as well. Things like the screening, the removal protection benefits, the training requirement, the written COVID plan. The time it takes to walk through all of those different considerations in a meaningful way and kind of manage all the iterations of it is probably greater than 30 days. So I'd encourage folks to at least start thinking through some of the different issues at your senior leadership level, game planning and war gaming some of the different scenarios that you might have to encounter. And to that end, what Barb and I will focus the next section of the webinar on is what kinds of considerations do you have to keep in mind? And I hope and trust, and I know this will answer some of the questions, the 65 or so questions that have already come through from the 1,400 or so people on the webinar. One is a big question: do you do something now? Or do you wait until the Biden administration's new rule from either the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services or OSHA come out? And a big part of that consideration, I think, is driven by industry. In the healthcare industry, I'd say a lot of almost all employers are moving towards some kind of mandate, at least a soft mandate where they're asking or even, quote, requiring employees to get vaccinated, but they're offering a weekly testing option instead. And that's something for other industries to consider as well. One data point I think is important for whether or not you implement something ahead of OSHA or CMS is what percentage of your employees are not yet vaccinated. And if you don't know that answer, I'd encourage you to start the process to find out. And you can do so through voluntary attestations. It's not a violation of HIPAA or confidential medical information if you do it the right way, but it's an important data point for you as an employer to know as you start planning for what this requirement or obligation may be down the road. And then to the extent that you think about whether you're going to implement the mandate or some soft mandate or hard mandate, think about whether you're unnecessarily drawing negative attention to yourself. And it gets ugly. And there is a lot of noise around even a soft mandate that you might seek to impose. And I tell you, the healthcare employers that went down this path and announced a mandate prior to Joe Biden standing up on September 9th, I think it was, and announcing this to the world, they went through a lot of heat, whereas I'd say employers who since then have announced their mandate or walked through that process have not gotten as much heat because a lot of that attention and ire is directed toward the Biden administration. And then another data point or consideration is if your employees do feel so strongly that they'll quit in the face of some kind of mandate, what does that look like for your business? At this point, it's easier for an employee to leave one job and walk across the street to another job. But when the mandate applies to everyone over 100 employees, it will be harder for them to find that other or additional job. You know, one thing to consider as well, and a couple of questions that we've seen so far have asked, what about employers with less than 100 employees? Will this apply to us? And so far, what we believe is the answer is no. And the president's directive so far has been to apply this to 100 or more employees in a single workplace or a single employer. That means that—
And remember, though, if I could interrupt, Tom, that is not what will happen for the healthcare providers. That is for the 100 employer mandate.
Correct. Good point. So if you're covered by if you want to keep your Medicaid and Medicare benefits and payments, if you're less than 100 employees, this will likely and almost certainly apply to you as well. If you're a restaurant with 100 or more employees on one side of the street, and there's a restaurant across the street with less than 100 employees, it's very easy for that employee to walk across the street, probably, given the state of workforce and staffing shortages in the country. It's probably easy for them to get a job across the street. So those are the kinds of considerations that you have to keep in mind with respect to the timing of your mandate. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Barb for a discussion about all the exemptions that people are also asking about.
Thank you, Tom. Just a couple follow-up points on what you all were just discussing. I think that some employers have elected to have their own mandate, but we're also seeing state departments of health issue mandates. And so that's where we're seeing some of the action in the healthcare space, as well as that they're being required to do it by a state board of health. The other comment that I'll make, and I'll elaborate later, but I think a lot of this next section that we're going to talk about is really going to hinge on your feelings and your industry and your market as it comes to staffing, because a lot of the next things that we discuss are not really all that black and white. And I think an opening question is, how bad is the staffing situation? Are you willing to go to the mat and say, I'm going to deny this religious exemption, which means this person is losing their job? Or do you really need that person to continue working? So staffing is really driving, I think, a lot of what happens next. So my assumption is that we have a mandate of some kind, whether it's your Department of Health, whether it's your state, whether it's the feds. Once you have a workplace requirement, there are laws that also require you to consider exemptions or exceptions to that workplace requirement. And I've seen a few questions in the chat about whether OSHA is going to, talk about religious exemptions. I'd be interested to hear what Brian has to say. My strong feeling is no way. OSHA is not going to get anywhere near that. Things like religious exemptions and medical exemptions exist in separate statutes, and we're not going to see OSHA say this is a religious exemption that's appropriate versus this is one that's not appropriate. So the questions about religion and disability and other objections are going to take place against the backdrop of these other statutes that have been in place for decades. But somehow when you take these statutes and try to apply them to COVID, just like everything else, no answers are really all that clear when it comes to COVID. So the first exemption that you're going to need to be familiar with comes under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this would be a medical or a disability related request from an employee to not be vaccinated. And sometimes we're seeing it so that they're not tested either. And so under the ADA, an employer has to provide an accommodation for a disability unless it creates an undue hardship. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the question here is, what is the disability or the medical exemption that your employees are going to request? And I think that's a little bit up in the air. I can tell you that the most obvious answer is whatever the vaccine labeling information says is a contraindication. Are you allergic to one of the components of the vaccine? That is going to be an appropriate medical request. But beyond that, I'm not sure how far it goes. So for example, we were talking before this webinar, if somebody has some sort of an autoimmune disease or a compromised immune system, that person may not be able to generate sufficient reaction to the vaccine to be protected from taking the vaccine. But that's probably not an objection to getting it. That's just information that says it's not going to be as effective for that employee. So there are definitely going to be questions about what is an appropriate medical or disability related exemption. I think that then flows into this next bullet, which is pregnant people. So what the EEOC has said in the general context of disability is that if someone is pregnant or nursing or trying to get pregnant in certain circumstances, that the employer has to offer them the same accommodations that they offer to others in the workplace for disability or religion. So the Pregnancy Discrimination Act would suggest that if you have someone in your workplace who has an allergy to a component in the vaccine, that you would need to give your pregnant people that same exemption. I will tell you that here in Colorado, our health department mandate only recognizes the contraindications on the labeling, and it doesn't address pregnancy. So it's unclear to me how that should be handled, because under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, pregnant people should have the same opportunities as people with disabilities.
You know, Barb, this is one where I would say it's one of the most explosive emotional employee relations considerations to go through. And those employees who are currently pregnant, who are currently nursing, or who are undergoing infertility treatment are passionate about it for understandable reasons. CMS and I think general medical guidance says the vaccines are fine for individuals who are pregnant, nursing, or undergoing infertility treatments. So I think that's an area where, in preparation for whatever comes from the government, employers can start the education process for all employees, but in particular those who are pregnant, nursing, or undergoing infertility treatment.
And this is also, Tom, you're right. This is a place where we come back to the staffing consideration. My guess is the people who fall into this bucket are very likely to choose to leave employment instead of taking a vaccine that they don't feel comfortable taking because of their pregnancy status. The next couple of categories relate to religious objections. The religious objections arise under Title VII. So again, we have decades of case law, but it's never been an area where there's been that much activity. And based on my current experience, and I'd be interested to hear from the others, I think this is where a lot of the play is going to be for people who do not want to get vaccinated. They are going to articulate a religious objection to taking the vaccine. I'm seeing a lot of that already. It often has to do with the use in some way of fetal stem cells and the development or the testing of the medication. And people also feel very strongly about that. So the religious exemption doesn't have to be an organized religion. It doesn't have to be something that has a church. It's essentially a sincerely held religious belief about or sincerely held moral or ethical belief as to what is right or wrong that is sincerely held with the strength of a traditional religious view. So you have to be really careful that you're not too narrowly defining religion. An interesting factor that we're seeing with some of these religious exemption requests in the fetal stem cells is that many people don't realize that a lot of the medications that we take on a daily basis were also developed and or tested in similar ways. So that includes things like Tylenol, Pepto-Bismol, aspirin, Claritin, and a whole list of those. So I see some employers who are choosing to push back a little bit more on the religious objection exemption requests by asking employees to certify that they haven't and they won't use these types of medications in future.
Barb, can I ask a quick question? Some of our guests have asked this question as well. It's really regarding record keeping. And so it's my sense that if there's an employee submitting an objection, first, we should track it. It should be available to recreate in that employee file, whether kept separately, and I'd love your thought on it, in the employee file. Should it be kept in the medical file if it's a request for a medical exemption? Because we know that most employers are keeping two separate files as they ought to. My guess is that we ought to be keeping very careful track of these requests, both to protect us from an employee saying that we discriminated, as well as if we don't mandate the vaccine and OSHA or CMS comes to us and said, hey, you've got 25 people who are working without being vaccinated. What's going on here? What are your thoughts about that, Tom and Barbara?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so we have developed forms, and the information that you're requesting on the form can vary in terms of how far you want to ask questions, how deep you want to go. But you're absolutely keeping a form. I have some clients that have developed committees, and the committee meets to consider the forms and then indicates whether it's granted or not granted. You absolutely want to keep those papers. I would say separately, certainly for the medical, I would keep them separately. But you're doing that to ensure consistency in what you're doing. You're doing that to ensure that you can prove to the health department, for example, that you've considered these exemptions. It's very important that this is all done in writing and retained. Absolutely. The other sort of objection or exemption request that we're starting to hear relates to right of conscience laws or conscientious objectors. And I think in Illinois, for example, and this is again in healthcare, but some healthcare workers have the right to refuse to perform certain types of procedures, if you think about abortion. But some of the language in these statutes is broad enough that it could be interpreted, or arguably be interpreted, that those healthcare providers could also refuse certain procedures themselves. And so that's a place where I think we're waiting to see some law develop on the conscientious objections. So not every state has that, but that's something to be thinking about. Political objections, we're seeing some of these, but I think our employees are probably getting a little bit smarter, and they're now being couched as religious objections. Political objections are generally not protected. Same with I don't believe in the science kinds of objections. But again, those I don't believe in the science objections are starting to slide over into religion. And so that's where it gets really complicated. Another category that we're seeing relates to people who have had COVID, or they've had some sort of treatment for COVID that they say now their immune system is stronger. So I don't think this is something that necessarily, it's certainly not a traditional exemption. It doesn't, to me, fit under the medical. I do think there are some circumstances where somebody needs to delay getting a vaccine due to recent COVID, for example. But that's another category of objections that we're at least seeing. Anything on those exemptions so far, gentlemen? Okay. So then,
Barbara, I would just say that
yes.
you mentioned earlier whether OSHA would refer to these exemptions in its rule. It won't in the rule, but it likely will in the preamble to the rule. It did in the healthcare preamble. And said that, of course, employers would be required to comply with the ADA and other statutes with regard to those exemptions. But as you pointed out, they certainly did not in the past get into how those would be applied or should be applied.
Excellent.
And I don't think OSHA has commented, or I'm sorry, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, has really given any new guidance since I think it was late May, maybe, on COVID and Title VII and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have to imagine the EEOC is working behind the scenes to try and address some of these issues, and hopefully we'll get some guidance with clear black and white rules as much as they can be on how employers have to or should manage through some of these different considerations.
And it's a bit of a conflict potential because this administration is quite employee and employee and union friendly. And Tom, you'll talk about that, and balancing that with the mandate that really is pushing the employer to take the laboring oar.
And certainly the EEOC has up until now taken a strong stance that COVID, for example, can be considered to be a direct threat. So they're not dancing around it. And I would expect the EEOC will be supportive of vaccinations. But you're right, it's going to be a really tough needle to thread. And that's why kind of reading the tea leaves on the law that's developed pre-COVID is complicated. So then when you get an accommodation request, let's assume that it falls into one of our two buckets, either the medical disability or the religion. And under the medical, it's just like what you would normally do under the ADA. You're getting some paperwork from a doctor, you're engaging in an interactive process, and you're trying to decide whether there's a reasonable accommodation that won't create an undue hardship on the organization, which is typically a very high standard for disability. But you also don't have to provide a medical accommodation if you're able to establish that it would create a direct threat to the employee or to others. And so we are seeing some healthcare employers take the position that being unvaccinated is a direct threat, and therefore you're not accommodating somebody with a disability by allowing them to work unvaccinated. Now, I would say that is very industry and situation specific. It's certainly not a blanket rule. Maybe that person needs a leave of absence for a period of time. Maybe they need to be located in a different job in a different place in your hospital. What's interesting is that religious accommodation requests have a much lower standard for the employer to have to meet before the employer can say they can't accommodate. So if an employer receives a religious accommodation request, and accommodation would be more than a de minimis burden on the employer, so more than just a little bit of trouble, the employer doesn't have to grant the accommodation request. And so I think rather than challenging the sincerity of a religious belief in most instances, the best option is for the employer to consider whether accommodating the request is going to be more than a de minimis burden. And that's going to depend on a lot of things like how many people do you have asking for a religious exemption request. If it's 2 people, maybe that's not a big deal. If it's 10 people, if it's 50% of your workforce, then it probably is more than a de minimis burden and you would not be accepting those accommodation requests. But all of this requires a process for considerate receipt and consideration of these exemption requests. And then finally, for this part of it, the potential accommodations, we've been talking about masking and testing. They may certainly be accommodations, remote work, an unpaid leave of absence. I know that United Airlines has announced that anybody that's seeking a religious exemption that's in a customer-facing role would be put on unpaid leave of absence. That's probably a little bit aggressive, but that's up to them to defend. I think something else to think about is when you're granting an accommodation, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent accommodation. So I'm thinking about religion, for example. If 2 people request the exemption, you can give it. If 10, 20, 25 do, then you may decide you cannot give religious exemptions anymore, and you would end up withdrawing your consent. So it doesn't have to be a permanent accommodation that you're agreeing to. And with that, anything more, Tom, to add to that?
One note I'd make is there's room, I think, to go the United Airlines route of saying the religious accommodation standard is anything more than a minimal cost. And the cost of an unvaccinated employee is too great for us as an employer to accommodate because of the monetary risk, the risk to our patients or customers or clients, the risk to the other employees who are there on site in the facility. So there's room for that argument. And like Barb said, you're almost certainly going to have to defend it. There's a difference between, being able to legally justify it and being sued by some employee or an attorney who may not have the best legal argument. So I think there's room for flexibility on the religious accommodation side. And I think the general trend over the last 3 weeks has been more and more employers saying no to religious accommodations or making the accommodations that they are providing something that's more significant than a medical exemption.
Well,
just
one
other
thought is that in the risk-benefit analysis that some of our clients and other employers are making, so it's more risky to have unvaccinated employees, and they are finding ways to have surcharges or other differentials placed in their insurance premiums. You have to be careful. That's another needle to thread. But certainly, we believe that there are ways in which you can quite appropriately have a different cost for health insurance, whether it's through wellness programs or otherwise, for those who've chosen not to become vaccinated under the theory that every vaccinated person, at least last I heard, on average, was an extra $22,000. Somebody's paying that. If it's your insurer, they're going to ask you to help carry that burden down the line.
Right. Just a quick note on non-employed service providers, independent contractors or consultants or temporary staffing agency employees. I saw one of the questions was related to that. generally you don't have the same level of responsibility in your workplace for non-employed third-party service providers. And frankly, you probably don't want that. You don't want to become a joint employer with the temporary staffing agency or the locums provider or some other service independent contractor. You don't have to necessarily, as an employer, worry about non-discrimination laws and wage and hour laws that might apply to these third-party non-employees. So one of the big considerations that you have to undertake is, do you, as the employer, the company where these third parties are coming to provide services, do the exemptions? Or do you say to your service provider, we won't take people who are not vaccinated? And you, service provider, temporary staffing agency, or locums provider, or independent contractor, you'll have to figure out whether these are legitimate exemptions or not legitimate exemptions. But we're not going to take that burden on. It's something that is a relationship-driven conversation, contractual-driven conversation. If you've got a contract, you'll need to look at that. If you're a university or other education service provider, you'll need to think about things like Section 504, disability responsibilities, the Families Educational Rights Protection Act, FERPA, and some of those considerations as well. But
Tom,
one of the things
can I add a caveat there? I think what you were speaking about is a staffing agency, for example, not just an independent contractor. So I caution the people on this call not to hear that as the individual person that you have working in your office who you've decided to call an independent contractor for whatever reason. Because if that person is misclassified, if they really are an employee, then you're in a world of hurt by doing what Tom is suggesting. So we're really only talking about true independent contractor relationships and not misclassified people.
Good point. The labor unions is another consideration. It's only around 11% or 12% or so of the private workplace. Public sector employers obviously have more labor unions, and healthcare, they're generally more prominent. Generally, keep in mind that President Biden has claimed himself to be the most pro-union president in history. He has taken steps to prove that. So I suspect we'll see something in the preamble of the new rules that addresses how employers should or must collectively bargain over either the decision of what kind of mandate they put in place or the effects and impact of that mandate. Depending on what your collective bargaining agreement says, you may have the need to bargain over the decision if you want to do this outside of the required government mandate. You likely, almost certainly, will have to bargain over the impact of this decision. And the union's going to come with requests for increased time off that's paid. They're going to come maybe for more requests of flexibility, and they're going to come with more requests for their own involvement as the union with respect to the progressive discipline or other corrective action process. Another data point. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, with all of this in mind, and especially I'm looking at a little calendar, a clock counting down, and most of our guests have stayed, so that's great. I think we're going to go a little over for those of you who can join us, because we'd really like to talk, at least for 5 minutes, on some of the considerations that you'd like to take into account now, perhaps, as whether some of the questions we have are from those who are not sure that they're 100 or not sure that they're going to be under the CMS guideline, and they're thinking about it, but especially those who feel confident that they're going to have to be engaged in meeting this mandate. So can our panel stay on for a little while? I think you can. And for our guests, we're going to go a little bit over. Let's not violate their time very much, but let's make sure we get to that question about things to do now as we close in at 1 o'clock.
Yep. One note on protected concerted activity, and it applies to both union and non-union employers. Keep in mind that an employee who is engaging in concerted activity with one or more other employees for their mutual aid or protection, that's called protected concerted activity, that's protected. So if it's an employee complaining about the COVID mandate with other employees in the break room, you probably can't discipline that employee for that discussion. The National Labor Relations Board just issued 2 guidance documents on this issue. One example was a letter that an employee sent to a bunch of employees' personal email addresses, not necessarily about the vaccine mandate of the employer, but just about the COVID vaccine and how they didn't agree with it and thought it was the mark of the beast and all sorts of other details. The National Labor Relations Board said that really wasn't tied to the workplace. That was just an employee generating concern among his coworkers. The coworkers came to the employer and said, can you stop this? So that's something that's not protected concerted activity. But if you've got an employee who says to another employee, let's have a protest at 5 p.m. in the parking lot to this vaccine mandate, I'll bring the signs, that's likely protected concerted activity. Be careful around disciplining or talking to the employee about that. What Tom Godar said, and one of the monumental issues is going to be your employee relations. And how do you manage that in the next couple weeks before the mandate comes out? And how do you mandate it or manage it through the process of implementing the mandate? A couple of just high-level thoughts. One is know your workforce. Know who's vaccinated and who's not vaccinated. And if you don't yet have a good sense of that, there is a process to do so. And a lot of the questions I saw were about how do we do that? What do we do about HIPAA or medical confidentiality requirements? We can help guide you through those kinds of questions to make sure you do it in the right way. But I think it's important. You want to know what your workforce thinks and how many employees potentially you could lose. Because I think you need to make sure you're thinking about the potential for disruption. And you see here, the New York hospital over this past weekend, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago now, where they had to shut down their neonatal service because they had so many employees who quit because they were going to be required to have a vaccine. So it's something to keep in mind to plan for. The other thing for you senior leaders and for those of you advising your senior leaders, just very, very much prepare for a lot of noise. It is going to get very loud and ugly. You should prepare for protests, perhaps even have a plan, a staffing plan for a lot of disruption. But more than anything, get to know the employees and start preparing for that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barb for some other more formal thoughts.
Yeah, and just in the interest of time, this things to do now list is really, we've covered many of these things, including some of the things that Tom just mentioned. I know that one we have not talked about yet is harmonizing other employment policies. So depending on your industry, you may already have things like influenza vaccine or other vaccine requirements. Pull out that policy, dust it off, see what it says. You probably also have some sort of statements or policies or procedures around things like disability requests, religious accommodations, paid time off, paid sick leave. Those are all the types of policies that we expect to be impacted by a vaccine mandate. I did see someone asking a question about, well, what if we already have a mandate or we're subject to a state mandate? What happens with the federal mandate? Are we exempt? It remains to be seen, but my gut is that whatever is the most employee favorable is what you will be bound to. So you may be covered by a state mandate, but if there is also some federal requirement for payment of time off, you are likely going to have to comply with that as well. But the federal-state interplay is very interesting. So I think that unless any of you have a comment on this slide, I'll go to the next slide. Which I think is a really exciting opportunity. So we are going to, with the email that you get tomorrow with the certificates of attendance and the recording of this webinar, we're also going to send you a SurveyMonkey link. We're interested in kind of benchmarking with this group what you're thinking about vaccines, what you may have in place already, information about your industry, your geography. And we really appreciate it if you complete that survey. We'll share the composite results with the attendees on this webinar. But I think that that's one of the valuable pieces, is just understanding what other people in your industry or your geography, how they're thinking about this and planning to handle it. So look for that SurveyMonkey link in the email that you'll get from us. And with that, I think we are over time. And unless any of my co-presenters have anything final they'd like to add, I can do the wrap up. information. They're shaking their heads at me. So again, thank you all for joining us today and for staying a little bit longer than we originally anticipated. We fully expect to be doing more of these webinars and certainly some writing as things develop. So stay tuned. If you haven't done it already, please click the survey icon at the bottom of your screen to complete the survey about today's presentation. And as a reminder, this program is pending approval for some CLE credit. I've seen questions about some of the states and CLE credit. Some of the states require a lot of lead time, so we're unable to get advance CLE credit for programs like this that are really important and timely. But you should certainly contact your bar for the possibility of submitting this as a home study to get the CLE credits. Your certificate of attendance can be downloaded from the certificate widget at the bottom of your screen. And again, we'll send you an email tomorrow with a copy of this webcast for you to review and share, along with the SurveyMonkey survey link that we hope that you will complete and return to us so we can do some benchmarking for you. And with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Indeed, we all join in thank you for joining us. Goodbye.